Most people think court cases are decided by facts, but often they are decided by procedure. And when procedure fails, the outcome can change everything. We are counting down the 10 most consequential courtroom errors, where simple mistakes in legal procedure changed the outcome of real cases. They range from missing jury instructions to denial of the right to counsel, from failure to suppress evidence to unlawful sentencing procedures, and to critical filing mistakes. Each example reveals how a single misapplied rule led to reversal, retrial, dismissal, or consequences that lasted for years. These are not dramatic moments. They are paperwork and process. That is where justice can quietly fail. We begin with number 10. John Nieder was charged with federal tax fraud. The case seemed routine until trial. The court was deciding whether Nieder had knowingly made false statements that could support a conviction. Federal law requires that juries determine every element of a charged offense. That rule exists to prevent convictions based on incomplete findings and to protect defendants by ensuring that juries make the factual determinations that create criminal liability. At trial, the judge instructed the jury on each element except materiality, the question of whether the false statements could actually influence a decision. Because materiality was omitted, the jury never considered that element. The trial record shows the omission plainly. On appeal, the Supreme Court acknowledged the omission, but applied the Chapman harmless error standard, concluding that overwhelming evidence proved materiality beyond a reasonable doubt. Nieder's conviction remained in place, even though a key element went unexamined by the jury, and the next error would take years to undo. John Sullivan stood trial in Louisiana for first-degree murder, a case that seemed to rest on clear evidence and eyewitness accounts. At the heart of the trial was the court's duty to instruct the jury on what it means to find guilt beyond reasonable doubt, a requirement rooted in both the Sixth Amendment and the Due Process Clause. The rule required the jury be told the correct legal standard. That standard exists to protect the presumption of innocence and to ensure that conviction follows proof beyond reasonable doubt. Instead, the judge described reasonable doubt as an actual substantial doubt and spoke of moral certainty, language the Supreme Court had already found unconstitutional. The instruction was incorrect, and the trial record showed the jury never received the required standard. The Supreme Court held that this kind of defect is structural, which means no amount of evidentiary strength can cure it. Sullivan's conviction was reversed, and the case was returned for a new trial, and the next error would take years to undo. Case 8. Gideon v. Wainwright, 1963. In 1961, Clarence Earl Gideon stood before a Florida judge accused of breaking and entering a pool hall. He asked the court to appoint a lawyer, saying he could not afford one. The judge refused, relying on state law that limited appointed counsel to capital cases. Forced to represent himself, Gideon made an opening statement, cross-examined witnesses, and argued his innocence. The jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The applicable rule is the Sixth Amendment right to counsel. That right guarantees representation in criminal prosecutions, and it exists to ensure a fair adversarial process. The central question was whether states must provide counsel to indigent defendants in felony cases. The Supreme Court ultimately held that the right to counsel applies to the states through the 14th Amendment, and that defendants facing serious charges are entitled to court-appointed counsel. What went wrong at trial was simple and specific. The judge refused to appoint a lawyer, and the court failed to apply the constitutional protection at stake. The record shows Gideon proceeded without counsel, performing tasks a trained advocate normally performs. The step that was skipped was the appointment of counsel for an indigent defendant charged with a felony. The consequence was decisive. The Supreme Court reversed Gideon's conviction and ordered a new trial. With a lawyer at his retrial, Gideon was acquitted. The absence of counsel rendered the first trial invalid, and the verdict it produced was effectively overturned. This is an example of how a single procedural denial can erase the meaning of a verdict, and the next error would take years to undo. In re Winship. Samuel Winship was 12 years old when he faced a juvenile court in New York. He was accused of stealing $112 from a woman's purse. The case appeared straightforward, and the court was deciding whether to adjudicate him delinquent. The court applied the preponderance of the evidence standard, the lower standard used in civil cases, meaning it was more likely than not that he committed the act. In criminal proceedings, the Constitution requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This rule exists to guard against wrongful convictions and to reinforce the presumption of innocence. The trial court used the lower civil standard and adjudicated Winship without the higher criminal protection. The record shows the court applied the wrong standard at the adjudication hearing. The Supreme Court reviewed the record and held that the Due Process Clause protects anyone facing criminal charges from conviction unless the government proves guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the wrong standard was used, the court vacated Winship's adjudication and required a new hearing under the correct standard, and the next error would take years to undo. Background: Charles Apprendi faced sentencing in New Jersey after firing shots into his neighbor's home. The jury convicted him of a firearms offense that carried a maximum 10-year sentence. At sentencing, the judge found, by a preponderance of the evidence, that Apprendi's actions were motivated by racial bias. That finding triggered the state's hate crime enhancement and raised the sentence to 12 years. The procedural rule: under the Sixth Amendment, any fact that increases the penalty beyond the statutory maximum must be submitted to a jury and proved beyond a reasonable doubt. This rule exists to protect the defendant's right to a jury determination of facts that would expose him to greater punishment and to preserve the constitutional burden of proof. The error: in Apprendi's case, the judge alone made the hate crime determination. The sentencing transcript shows the jury never weighed this element. The court relied on judicial fact-finding by a standard of preponderance rather than a jury verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. The consequence: the Supreme Court vacated Apprendi's sentence, holding that judicial fact-finding on elements that increase punishment violates the right to a jury trial. The case was remanded for resentencing under the correct rule, and the next error would take years to undo. Freddie Booker was convicted in federal court of drug offenses. At sentencing, the judge, not the jury, determined the amount of drugs involved, a finding that increased Booker's sentence under the federal sentencing guidelines. At the time, these guidelines were mandatory, and judges had to impose sentences within the range set by the facts they found. The rules required that any fact raising a sentence beyond what the jury's verdict alone would permit had to be proved to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. In Booker's case, that step was skipped. The sentencing transcript shows the judge applied a higher range based solely on his own findings. The Supreme Court ruled this violated the Sixth Amendment, echoing its earlier decision in Apprendi. To address the widespread impact, the court severed the statute's mandatory provisions, making the guidelines advisory. Every federal sentence since has been shaped by this procedural correction, and the next error would take years to undo. In Cleveland in 1957, police forced entry into Dalry Mapp's home without a valid search warrant, seeking a bombing suspect. They found a trunk of obscene materials instead, and charged Mapp with possession under Ohio law. At trial, prosecutors introduced the seized evidence over defense objection that the search was illegal. At the time, federal courts followed a long-standing rule that barred the use of evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment. That rule, the exclusionary rule, exists to deter unlawful searches and to protect constitutional rights. Most state courts did not apply that rule, creating a gap between federal and state practice. The trial judge admitted the materials, and the jury convicted Mapp. The error was procedural. The court allowed evidence obtained in an illegal search to be used against the defendant despite an objection on the record. The record shows the entry, the objection, and the decision to receive the seized trunk. On appeal, the Supreme Court held that the exclusionary rule applies to state courts as well. Evidence gathered through unconstitutional searches could no longer be used against defendants in any American courtroom. Mapp's conviction was reversed, and the case set a national standard that when the government breaks the rules, the evidence does not come in, and the next error would take years to undo. Keith Bowles filed a federal habeas petition after his state murder conviction was affirmed. The district court denied relief. A clerical oversight meant neither Bowles nor his lawyer received timely notice. By the time they learned, the 30-day window to appeal had closed. Under federal rules, the court could grant only 14 extra days to reopen the appeal period. The rule exists to preserve finality and jurisdictional limits. The court was required to honor the statutory 30-day deadline. Instead, the judge ordered 17 days, an error of 3 days. Bowles relied on the court order and filed his notice of appeal on day 16, which was within the time the judge set, but 2 days after the statutory deadline. The record shows the judge exceeded the statutorily authorized extension. The appellate court dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction. The Supreme Court affirmed, holding that statutory time limits for appeals are absolute. Even an error by the judge could not create leeway. Bowles lost his right to appellate review, not because of the merits, but because of a filing date set by mistake and enforced without exception. And the next error would take years to undo. Jennifer Arbaugh was a waitress at the Moonlight Cafe in Louisiana. She sued Y&H Corporation for sexual harassment under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. After a jury awarded her damages, Y&H challenged the case, arguing it did not have the 15 employees required for Title VII to apply. The district court, following circuit precedent, dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction, wiping out the verdict. The Fifth Circuit agreed, treating the employee count as a jurisdictional barrier. The Supreme Court saw it differently. In a unanimous opinion, the court held that Title VII's 15-employee rule is not a jurisdictional requirement, but an element of the plaintiff's claim. Congress had not clearly stated that this threshold limits a court's power to hear the case. Because Y&H waited until after the trial to raise the issue, it was too late. The ruling established a clear statement rule. Only Congress can make a rule jurisdictional, and without that, late objections cannot erase a jury's verdict. Background: in United States v. Cotton, federal prosecutors charged several defendants with conspiracy to distribute cocaine. The case seemed straightforward. The indictment named the offense, but omitted a critical fact: the specific drug quantity that determines whether the statutory maximum is 20 years or life in prison. The procedural rule: under the Fifth Amendment, any element that increases a statutory maximum must be alleged in the indictment and proven to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. That rule exists to protect the right to fair notice and the jury's independent judgment. The court was required to ensure the indictment included every element that could raise the maximum punishment. The error: in Cotton, neither the grand jury nor the trial jury ever considered the drug quantity. The issue went unchallenged at trial. The judge found the relevant facts about quantity, and the court imposed life sentences based on those facts. The record shows the indictment omitted quantity, and no objection was made during trial. The consequence: on appeal, the Supreme Court acknowledged the omission, but because no one objected at trial, the court applied plain error review. The evidence of quantity in the record was overwhelming, so the convictions and life sentences were upheld. The constitutional defect remained on the record, unresolved, and the case closed with a quiet reminder that procedural failure can persist when it goes unnoticed, and the next error would take years to undo. Across all 10 entries, one pattern stands out. Even the smallest procedural error can reshape a verdict, a life, or the law itself. In courtrooms, justice does not hinge on drama, it pivots on process. That silent vulnerability is part of our legal system's ongoing reality.